If you are a regular listener to the Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hi, welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. My guest for this episode is Dr. Laura Way from the University of Lincoln. Laura is currently part of the Following Young Fathers Further Research team, along with Dr. Anna Tarrant. So if you haven't yet listened to that episode, do go back and listen to that one. And Laura is also currently conducting research on ageing punk women. So Laura, thank you very much for coming onto the show.
Thank you for having me.
I gave you a little short introduction there, but did you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself, please?
Yeah, so I'm based at the University of Lincoln. I joined there in January as a research fellow on the Following Young Fathers Further study, which is led by, as you said, Dr. Anna Tarrant. And there's myself and Lindsay Ladlow as the research fellows on that study. So that's my current position. And as well as that, I'm on the steering committee of the Punk Scholars Network as well. And some of my research previously and at the moment is focused on punk.
Great. We'll come back onto that in a moment. I always ask people where sociology started for you. Did you study it at school or at A-level?
I studied it at A-level. It's a bit bad to say, but it was a bit of a almost like a fluke, really, that I picked up sociology. I was at college. I was doing my A-levels. I wasn't a particularly great student. I'd messed around quite badly for 2 years, and I was wanting to go to university and was very aware of the fact that I didn't have enough UCAS points to get into uni. So I needed an AS level, and I picked up sociology. I was already doing psychology as an A-level. Picked up AS sociology. I just thought, might fit in quite well, bit of overlap with research methods. And I absolutely loved it. I thought it was fantastic. And the thing that really stuck out for me as well, because at this time, I'd been playing in bands for a couple of years. And I remember one lesson in sociology where our teacher just walked in and put on some Sex Pistols as an introduction to starting to talk about youth cultures. And so that was just amazing for me that I could actually kind of, I guess, learn about things that I was part of as part of my personal life and my life outside of college. I could learn about them in an academic setting as well. I could never have imagined that punk would be something that, you could actually learn about and look about in that way. So, so it was fantastic in that sense. It really opened up my eyes. I'd applied to go to uni to do an English degree, and I ended up at the end of the first year, I'd switched over to sociology and ended up doing a single sociology degree. Absolutely loved my degree. Went on to do a master's in women's studies at the University of York. Because for me, even before I'd done the AS in sociology, it was always things to do with gender were fascinating for me. When I was doing English Lit, I always wanted to look at things from a kind of, femininity, masculinity, feminist kind of perspective. So I did the Masters in Women's Studies. From there, I applied for a PhD, didn't get funding, couldn't fund myself at that point. So I did a PGCE and ended up being a sociology teacher, A-level and access, for about 6 or 7 years. And then finally, I ended up self-funding my PhD in sociology, and that's really kind of where we're up to, I guess, now. So I completed that last year. So my PhD was on the Asian punk women.
Great. We will come back onto that. You mentioned you were interested in gender and also youth subcultures. What sort of theorists were you reading about? Who kind of inspired you at the time?
Well, back when I was doing my AS and then a bit in my degree as well, I really enjoyed reading the work of the kind of early Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, and those early, I guess, studies of youth subcultures. I really enjoyed reading about those. I liked reading as well the work of Angela McRobbie, who actually started then to look at girls in that kind of subcultural context. And I think for me, a lot of feminist theory was influential, and what I really enjoyed reading. And key sociologists that stood out to me, I mean, Anne Oakley, right from the beginning, I thought her work was absolutely fantastic. I loved the fact, reading around how she'd first started with the housework study, how she'd approached it, how she was told to approach it, going, trying to knock on doors of a survey and then realising that didn't work and move into qualitative interviews. I really loved that kind of thing. And I really enjoyed reading her work. And also as well, as I was becoming more and more interested in looking at the study of punk and in particular punk women, though she didn't look just specifically at punk women, she looked at women more broadly in subcultures. I found the work of Samantha Holland really inspiring. I later went on as well to meet Samantha, and she was just fantastic in terms of her writing and her research, and just as a person as well, in getting me thinking about different things and how to approach my work.
Oh, it's interesting you said Angela McRobbie, because she's done a podcast, one of the most popular, most downloaded podcasts actually, and she was really a kind of pioneer in terms of looking at punk music and rock music as well. So I did think that name was going to come up in terms of one.
Yeah.
So let's get into that then. Tell us about this work, Aging Punk Women. Is that right?
It was. I started to look at this for my dissertation actually, with my master's in women's studies. And then the plan was to obviously develop it into a PhD. I guess the starting point, I was interested in punk and the experiences of people within punk and punk communities. There was a lot being said about punk, which perhaps it wasn't based on the actual voices of those people that were involved. So first of all, that was really important for me. And even though there was more work coming out, which was looking at women within punk, they were still largely invisible or marginalised in academic work on punk. There was a fantastic book by Lorraine LeBlanc called Pretty in Punk, and I remember reading that, and it was really refreshing to actually read something, exploring women within the punk scene. With regards to the ageing aspect, for me, and this is where the personal and I guess the academic kind of start to overlap. At the time, I was in my 20s, and even then I was starting to sometimes go to gigs and feel a bit old. And I was really interested in thinking then about that aspect of, what does happen for punks as they get older? Because a lot of the research as well, a lot of the theory about youth subcultures had this tendency to say that you just basically grew out of it. It's something that you did when you're a teenager. You grow out of it and you leave it behind. And when I started reading around, I came across the body of literature, which was more the kind of post-youth subcultural work, actually looking at those participants that retained some kind of subcultural participation or affiliation as they got older. In terms of punk, then there was one main piece of work, and that was by Andy Bennett, and it's called Punk's Not Dead. And it's about older male punks. And it really did get me thinking then that, first of all, in punk generally, there was this marginalisation of women punks. And now there seemed to be this kind of double invisibility, that there wasn't really much being said on older punk women. And even though this was developed a bit more later on, there was one bit in Andy Bennett's work that stuck out to me when he said about, there wasn't really any punk women at the gigs I went to. Maybe they just listened to their records in private now. And that really stuck out to me, because I kind of knew that wasn't the case. I knew that there was plenty of punk women out there, still active and stuff. So I think that in a way was a key factor in me then thinking, right, I'm going to give those women a voice. They're not, they're not being included. So I did a small kind of scale research on older punk women for my master's, and then developed it further into the PhD. So it ended up, I spoke with 22 women from across the UK, ranging from, so the youngest woman was 27, ranging up to mid-50s. And I spoke to them using qualitative interviews, some of which were face-to-face. Sometimes it would be telephone or Skype, depending on their geographical location. And the fact I was self-funded, so I didn't have any money to necessarily travel far distances, and I was working. So all of that's kind of factor in. From there, the PhD was developed, really. So exploring how these women understand punk, what punk means to them, and then how they negotiate that as they get older as women. So looking at the kind of overlapping relationship between punkness, punk identity, punk expression, aging and gender. And I ended up focusing on a couple of main areas that had come out from the interview. So things to do with their relationship to music, their relationship to dress and style, and things like kind of markers of adulthood. So things like employment, having children, those kinds of things.
Kind of stereotype of punk, I suppose, is that it's kind of teenage rebellion, anti-establishment. So there's kind of this feeling that many people grow out of that once they go into full-time employment, start a family, move to the suburbs, all those sort of things. Is that generally the rule?
No, it wasn't always the case. There was different kind of strategies, I guess, that the women adopted for negotiating, getting older, and what adulthood might bring, and then retaining punkness and retaining their kind of punk identity. So for some women, it might be the case that the way that they expressed punk changed, and they might tone down, for example, the way that they dressed, the way that they looked, so that they could still identify with punk, but it became more about the values that they held rather than the way that they outwardly expressed it. But that wasn't the case for all the women. So it could be very different, and it could depend, for example, on the nature of work that they had gone into. Some of the women felt that the nature of work that they went into had allowed them to not tone down and to retain the way that they looked. For other women, punk was never about the way that they looked. So there wasn't this kind of sense of toning down style as they aged, because they never felt that they were, well, they described it as never massively outrageous to begin with. So there could be different things like that, and it could be very much down to what punk meant to them in the first place, and then how they could make that work for them as they got older. Some of the women, for example, would take some of the punk values that they held as important, so things like the DIY ethic, so do it yourself, individual, responsibility, and they'd realise that value through the type of work that they did. So for them, they were still punk, and they were still able to express that value that was important to them, but they were doing it perhaps in a different way to what they had done when they were younger. So they were able to continue their punk affiliation, but they might have expressed it in different ways to what they had done before.
And was there a parallel with the male old school punk rockers as well? Did the men tend to tone it down as well, or was the female quite distinct and different?
Based on the research on the male punks, there is this sense of a toning down as well. I mean, Bennett's work in particular talks about the males toning down their style, but maybe still retaining kind of little key markers that could link them to the punk subculture, and this internalization of punkness as they age. So it's more to do with punk values being important, more so than the outwardly expression of punk. So so there are some similarities, but at the same time, it wasn't necessarily the case for all of the women. So some of the women, in their view, they hadn't toned down. They were always going to look, how they looked, and they completely rejected, what they saw as expected of them, really, as they were getting older and also as being a woman.
So did many of them view punk as political as much as a music scene?
It was one of the key values. So in the research, in my PhD, there were these common set of punk values that the women identified. So there was 4 key values that emerged across the interviews, and political consciousness or political awareness was one of those values that they saw as a punk value. The nature of that, though, wasn't always clear. Some of the women spoke about anarchism, for example, whereas others wouldn't use that kind of language. But becoming more politically aware and conscious was seen as part of your kind of socialization into punk, listening to music and listening to some music which might have political undertones, and then becoming more aware of what that actually meant, the more that they become involved in punk, I guess.
Because it sounds like, from what you're saying, and do correct me if I'm wrong, but the women that are into the scene is quite diverse. I mean, we have quite a distinct idea of what a punk looks like, but are you saying that you could have, a suburban middle class career woman who also has a punk scene in her spare time?
Well, yeah. It's and I think that's something as well that I wanted to explore a bit through the research, was what actually could be considered punk, and how that might kind of rub up against some of the public perceptions of what punk is. The group that I spoke with were diverse, and I think that also relates to the point in time in which they became involved in punk. So some of them had become involved in punk, for example, in the 70s, 80s, whereas others might have become involved in punk more in the 90s and more for a pop punk kind of route. So there were definitely differences there. One of the things that I grappled with when I started the research was how I was going to advertise for the women, how I was going to kind of approach women to interview. One of the things that my supervisors said was, well, what are you counting as punk? What does punk mean to you? And I was desperate to not kind of pinpoint exactly what I thought punk was, because I felt that then I was just putting my own view of punk onto participants. So I did just keep it very broad and just said, are you an older punk woman, etc., etc. And it was really interesting when then I was speaking to the women in the interviews that a lot of them wouldn't describe themselves as punk. They wouldn't call themselves a punk. So despite kind of answering this advert, asking for older punk women, it wasn't a label though that they actually felt kind of happy declaring. So it was just really interesting thinking about kind of that identity construction. Is that to do with punk's history of rejecting labels and wanting to be anti-conformist? Possibly. But yeah, I found that quite interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting that they didn't want to define themselves as that. Does punk come with some negative connotations then? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, there can be negative connotations, and I do explore it a bit more, and there is perhaps this idea as well of imposter syndrome. There's a lot to do with authenticity and authenticity kind of claims within subculture. So who gets seen to be an authentic punk, who might have their kind of punkness questioned. And for some of the participants, there was this kind of sense that they didn't really want to kind of outright declare themselves as a punk, because they were worried that they might be challenged on that, perhaps because they didn't look how a stereotypical punk looks, perhaps because they weren't there, in the original kind of 70s punk, explosion. So so there's some really interesting kind of ideas around identity construction going on there.
And what about social class? How important is social class to the punk scene?
Well, historically, it was very much rooted in, class. A lot of the writing was about punk as a working class subculture. However, it wasn't something that I wanted to explore. If it was something that had kind of come through, then of course I would have considered that. But yeah, I wanted to very much try and focus on the gender and the age and kind of aspects more so than the class.
So let's explore more about the aging women then. So
yeah.
what did many people feel? Did they feel that they drifted away from the scene as they aged?
In terms of scene, do you mean like a physical kind of scene? Yeah. For some, there was definitely a sense of that. There could be various reasons for that. There was, for some women, there was the idea of having children. That could be a factor, whereby when they had kids, the assumption was that they'd be the ones that would be at home looking after the kids. They might have a partner who was, still going to gigs or playing in a band, and it was almost expected that that was okay, and they were able to do that. So for them, the physical kind of scene and going to gigs that aspect might have been removed. I guess the main thing though was the impact that being in work could have on maintaining a kind of physical presence in going to gigs. And there was lots of talk about, after a day at work and then knowing that you've got work the next day, you start to kind of weigh up, the costs and benefits really. And quite a lot of the women I spoke to would say, when you're younger, you just don't give a shit, basically, do you? You go to a gig, you're knackered, and then the next day, you do whatever. But now there was this sense of the importance of professional identity and how they didn't want to be tired the next day for work. They didn't want to be hungover for work the next day. So for a lot of them, that was, a key kind of factor in them not having as regular a presence in the scene as perhaps what they'd had done when they were younger.
Do you mind telling us about one of your participants? Do you mind telling us one of their stories?
Who would that's really unfair because they're so fascinating. There's one who, it's just fantastic. One of the things that she'd brought to the interviews. So one of the things that I'd said to the participants is if they had anything that they wanted to bring to the interview that they felt helped kind of convey the significance of punk to their lives, to bring it to the interview. So some participants brought photos and things. And one of the participants, she brought what she described as her trolley of punk. So her trolley of punk was one of those shopping trolleys. And I know stereotype here, and it's something that I unpack a little bit in the thesis, but it's the thing that you would imagine a more elderly person, an elderly lady to have, that she pulls along behind her with her shopping in. And she was very aware of that as well. She had got it because of health problems that she'd been having, and she was aware of the kind of stereotype that came along with this, and she had spoken about this. And she said that in order to kind of, I guess, counter that, she'd made it into her trolley of punk, and she, along with her partner, had graffitied this shopping bag and put like band patches on it, and there was some swearing on it as well. So she said it was great when she'd be pulling it along and then someone would spot it and be like, oh, what's that? What does that say? And so she'd kind of just punked it basically, and made it into something that again visually displayed, her affiliation to punk. And she'd brought it along to the interview, and she'd brought her, a lot of her record collection with her as well in her trolley of punk. But there was lots of stories about things that she'd done in terms of some quite quirky kind of acts of vandalism and things, which I'm not sure whether I can disclose some of those, but yeah, it was just really, really interesting.
I find it quite interesting that a lot of youth subcultures, many people obviously leave behind as they get into their 20s and older, but it seems that a lot of people who are into the punk scene keep it, maintain it. It remains part of their life.
I don't know, really. In terms of the women that I spoke with, I think there did seem to be this sense that because there'd been punk for them had been this, kind of, they'd gone into a community where there were these values and kind of things that became important to them and important to their beliefs and lifestyle. So I think those kinds of things are quite hard to escape, aren't they? Once they become quite ingrained into your belief system, yeah, how do you always kind of leave those things behind? And perhaps as well, I think, and a lot of music can have such an emotional impact on us as well. And a lot of the participants that I spoke to, could recall the very first song and how it made them feel. So I think, those kinds of things do stick with us.
There's quite a parallel, I would say, with kind of the rave scene, the rave scene that during the late 80s and into the early 90s. So a lot of the people that are into that scene are now in their late 40s and 50s, but they still seem to hold on to that. The amount of nostalgia that's talked about to do with a particular track or a particular event that people went to. It's still kind of big business, and those people that, like I said, are now in their 40s and 50s, most of them parents and some grandparents, but they still hold on to that youth subculture of their past.
Yeah. And I think, maybe that is, in a way, it's the kind of power of music, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there has been a lot wrote on nostalgia and music and kind of memory and music as well. In fact, one of the punk scholars, Matt Grimes, his PhD recently was more to do with older punks and memory and nostalgia. So yeah, I'm sure he'd have a much more informed answer to that question than I would.
So how are you getting on with the research? Are you almost complete, or when is it due to be complete, Laura?
So that is complete. So it was finished and submitted and passed. That was last year.
Great. And what about future publications? What do you aim to do with the rest of the research?
The monograph based on the PhD is due out with Emerald next month. So I think it's the 14th of September. And then aside from that, I've been I still do other things to do with punk kind of scholarship. And I'm doing some work with Frances Stewart around punk pedagogy or pedagogies. So I've got that as well. So that's kind of the two. Yeah, I've got my punk side of research, and then I've got my young fathers side of research. So those are the two kind of main areas that I'm working on.
Two very contrasting areas there.
yeah, contrasting, but yeah, it's quite interesting where there are kind of areas of overlap.
And can I just ask you for the listeners how they could get in contact if they wanted to find out more about your work? And I know you're also on Twitter as well.
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter. It's just Dr. Dr. Laura Way, I think it is the handle. I'm not very good with all the kind of social media stuff. Yeah, other than that, for the punk kind of scholarship, there's the Punk Scholars Network, and we have a website which is punkscholarsnetwork.com, I believe, off the top of my head. But if you put it into Google, it should come up. And there's some more information about the work that I do on there, as well as the other punk scholars and the Following Young Fathers as well. If anyone's listened to the podcast with Anna, there's the blog which kind of follows our journey with that side of things.
Thank you very much for your time today, Laura. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Cheers.
If you are a regular listener to the Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.